Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Chapter 1. It was late at night in a town in England during the Industrial Revolution. At this time, most English towns needed people to work in the factories that were beginning to open all over the country. Many people came to the towns to find work, but they were often so poor that they couldn't buy enough to eat, and they had nowhere to sleep. So they went to the houseworks, where at least they had a bed and some sort of food. In one such workhouse, an old nurse and a doctor were working in a small, dark room looking at a baby boy that had just been born. The baby found it difficult to breathe. They didn't know if he would live. "What's the mother's name?" the doctor asked the nurse. "I don't know. She arrived at the workhouse last night," said the nurse. "She was ill and weak when she came." When the baby cried, the mother said weakly, "Can I see my new baby?" The nurse picked up the tiny boy and the mother saw him for the first time. She kissed him gently on the cheek and smiled. Then the mother died. "Poor woman," said the nurse. "She was so beautiful, we'll never know who she was." The baby was called Oliver Twist. He was sent to live with other orphans in an old house nearby. The orphans were all the children of parents who had been destitute. A woman called Mrs. Mann was given a little money to look after the orphans, but she decided that she needed some of this money for herself. For this reason, the boys never had very much to eat. On his 9th birthday, Oliver was a small, weak child. He had spent all his life in the old building with Mrs. Mann, who was no kinder to Oliver than she was to the other orphans. Oliver didn't go to school and he didn't know the world outside. One day, an important man called Mr. Bummel visited Mrs. Mann. Mr. Bummel was an official from the workhouse, where the older children from poor families were big enough to work for their food. Oliver was not sad to leave Mrs. Mann, but he was sad to leave his friends and the only home he had ever known. He felt wretched as the door to the house was closed behind him. "Why are you crying? You are very lucky to work here," the managers of the workhouse told Oliver when he arrived. "We'll give you food and a bed for nothing." The workhouse was a large, cold building. Oliver was introduced to the other boys who were all as thin and weak as he was. They wore old clothes that were too big for them. Oliver worked hard at the workhouse with these boys and quickly realized that his life was not going to become any easier. His bed was very uncomfortable and the food was never enough. All they ate was a thin soup. The boys he worked with were always hungry. After a few months they were all so close to starving that they made a plan. They decided they must have more food and they chose Oliver to ask for it. That evening in the big cold hall, the boys finished eating the usual thin soup. Then Oliver stood up and walked to the master, who gave them their food. "Please, sir, I want some more," said Oliver. The master was furious. No one had ever asked for more before. "What did you say?" he cried. There was now silence in the big room. "Please, sir, I want some more," Oliver repeated. The master angrily took Oliver's arm and immediately led him to the managers of the workhouse. He told them what Oliver had said. "If he isn't happy with our generosity," the manager said, "he must leave." They decided to lock Oliver in a room and put a message on the door of the workhouse. It said that the workhouse would give £5 to anyone who could take the boy away from them. For weeks, Oliver stayed in the cold, dark room. He cried himself to sleep each night, then woke up each morning and began to cry again. He had never felt so alone. He was only taken from the room when it was time to eat. Mr. Bummel didn't want any of the other boys to ask for more food, so while they were eating, Mr. Bummel made Oliver stand in front of them. Then he beat Oliver. This happened every day until a man called Mr. Sorbury read the message on the workhouse gate. Mr. Sorbury, the coffin maker, decided that he needed an apprentice and told Mr. Bummel that he could take Oliver Twist. A new chapter in the boy's life was about to start. The next day, Mr. Bummel took Oliver from the workhouse and walked with him to Mr. Sorbury's house. As they were walking down the street, Mr. Bummel was surprised to see that Oliver was crying. "Why are you crying?" Mr. Bummel shouted. "You should be happy to have the opportunity to work with someone like Mr. Sorbury." "I'll be a good boy," said Oliver. "But I have no... You have no what?" asked Mr. Bummel. "I have no friends, sir," said Oliver quietly. Mr. Bummel was not interested in Oliver's feelings. They continued to Mr. Sorbury's house, but when Oliver's new employer saw him, he wasn't very happy. "He is very small, Mr. Bummel," Mr. Sorbury complained. "He is small, but he will grow," explained Mr. Bummel. "But it will cost money to feed him," said Mr. Sorbury's wife. She took Oliver downstairs and gave him some old food that they hadn't eaten. "Now get some sleep," said Mrs. Sorbury. "You don't mind sleeping down in the shop, do you?" "There is nowhere else to sleep in our house." Oliver was alone in a strange dark room, surrounded by unfinished coffins. It wasn't much better than the room he had slept in at the workhouse. It wasn't easy for him to sleep. The next morning, Oliver woke up to the sound of someone kicking the shop door. Oliver opened it and saw a tall boy with a red nose eating some bread. "Hello, I am Noah Claypole," he said. "You are from the workhouse, aren't you?" He continued walking into the shop as if he lived there. "I help Mr. Sorbury." "You do what I say, workhouse boy." "Now open the shutters," he ordered. giving Oliver a small kick to make sure he knew who was the master. Mrs. Sorbury called and asked Noah to sit by the fire to have some breakfast. She gave Oliver a little bread and told him to eat it down below. It was freezing. It was freezing cold there. Why can't I have a good breakfast like Noah? He asked. But there was no one there to hear him. For the next few months, Oliver worked with Mr. Sorbury. He didn't like the work, but Mr. Sorbury seemed pleased with him. This, however, didn't please Noah Claypole, who was told to work inside when Oliver went out with Mr. Sorbury. One day, after work, the two boys were alone in the shop. "What happened to your mother, workhouse boy?" said Noah. Oliver said quietly, "The nurse said she died of a broken heart." "I hear she died in the workhouse because she was no good at anything," laughed Noah. "What did you say?" cried Oliver, feeling both ashamed and angry. "I hear that if she hadn't died, they would have punished her," Noah cried unkindly. Oliver stood up and started to hit Noah hard. "Help!" shouted Noah. "He is killing me! Help!" Mr. and Mrs. Sorbury ran in and pulled Oliver away from Noah. "Help me! Lock him in here!" they said to Noah. They pulled Oliver into a dark cellar and locked the door. "You poor boy," Mrs. Sorbury said to Noah. "We must get Mr. Bummel at once." When Mr. Bummel heard what had happened, he hurried to Mr. Sorbury's house and knocked on the door to the cellar. "Oliver, do you know who is speaking?" he called loudly. "Yes," said Oliver. "Aren't you afraid, Oliver?" he continued in a menacing voice. "No," Mr. Bummel looked at Mr. Sorbury in a surprise. "I understand the problem," said Mr. Bummel. "You have given him too much meat, Mrs. Sorbury. You have been too kind to him. Leave him in the cellar without food for a few days, then feed him only soup," he advised. That night, in the cold cellar, Oliver tried to cry himself to sleep yet again, but he felt too angry to sleep. When the house was quiet, he went to the door and realized it wasn't locked. He waited until it was just light and quietly opened the door. No one was awake, and it was easy to leave. It was easy to leave the house without anyone realizing. He knew he couldn't stay in that place any longer. His life was unbearable. It was time for him to run away.